Do big name acquisitions make sense in comics? A long time ago, so, man, I hate saying it that way. We had Jack Kirby go to DC, and there was a huge fanfare for Jack Kirby, and he's a big name in the industry that made sense. And then we had John Byrne go to DC, and there was a similar, yes, theatrics, I guess, or marketing. And more recently, we saw Bendis coming. And he said big kind of ads promoting Brian Michael Bendis, and it also, they did it in very much a homage to Jack Kirby, which probably irritated some people. But uh, of these big name acquisitions, do they make sense? Do they make money? And is it viable to continue that going forward? Hey everybody, this is Perch. There's a lot of online commentary about Brian Michael Bendis' move to DC, and was it a good plan? Was it good? Did DC get their money's worth? Has it been a success? And it's that nobody really likes to hear this answer, but it is way too early to tell. Brian Michael Bendis, in theory, signed a long-term agreement with DC to write some of their characters. We haven't really seen what that's going to look like yet. It seems like it's been many years, but it really hasn't. In the grand scheme of things, it's probably going to need another 5 years before we really see how this all worked out. Bendis came right out of the gate strong in the sense that he was suddenly put on a ton of books. I would argue he overcommitted himself by being on just too much too fast, and kind of didn't give him a chance to really stick the landing. But there are certainly people who like what Bendis has done, both with Leviathan, with Legion, with Superman. There are fans of those books. You'd be lying if you said that everybody hated them. But I think for DC, in terms of the acquisition they were getting, and arguably, I think you could say that Bendis was probably the industry's most known writer at that point. His name was associated with some of the biggest events Marvel had done. He was seen as kind of one of their premier people, so it was a very big get. And part of that deal was certainly to bring a network of people Bendis knew. He has a bubble of people, and so it was the idea that more talent would follow him, and it would be a resurgence for DC. It was certainly something that Dan Didio was very excited about. The challenge is it didn't necessarily work out. And again, I want to preface by saying it's definitely possible that things will change and evolve and it will all work out in the end. But at first glance, it certainly seems like the hype and, in theory, the money and the other things they paid him didn't necessarily translate to the sales and the attention they were hoping for. Uh, so, where does that, it begs the question, who is worth that money? Marvel has certainly brought in a bunch of big, high-profile names from outside of comics and promoted them. Ta-Nehisi Coates being probably one of the biggest. Joss Whedon before that with Astonishing X-Men. The challenge is these big names. They certainly sell books and they create a showcase. But if you look at maybe the most recent one, and that's J.J. Abrams and Son doing the Spider-Man series, the first issue sold very well. It was marketed to, but then it kind of fell off the map. And with the COVID situation, it's completely in limbo. We don't know when that storyline's getting finished, but the momentum is gone from that story. I think Marvel's probably hoping that there will be a pretty nice pickup in trade paperback down the road, but as it currently stands, that title's in limbo with no signs of returning at the moment. Um, I've come more and more to the conclusion as you look and you take the big picture of things, where writing is concerned, big names putting on a book don't often work out well. And when I say don't work out well, I mean it's either kind of a non-factor or a disappointment in a lot of cases. It hasn't produced kind of the huge halo effect that maybe things back in the 80s and 90s did. And I also think I have an increasing question in my mind of, can writers ever pull this kind of weight in a comic book? If you suddenly announced that if you said George Perez is going to do this book, or John Byrne is going to do this book, or, and those are older, but if you said that J. Scott Campbell was going to do I don't know, a Lois Lane book, or Michael Mignola was going to do a Hulk book, I think that those names, that artistic, the artists, tend to have a little bit more pull at this point than the writers. And I know this flies in the face of what the publishers believe, very much so. There's very much a hardened belief that the writers are the big names. But if I look at death metal, for example, Scott Snyder is as big a name at DC as you can get. He's put some big titles, and his name definitely draws attention, draws money. Greg Capullo it does not have the same kind of fanfare and is not marketed as much as Scott Snyder by any stretch of the imagination. Snyder's name is a little bit more promoted, and he's been a great spokesman. So this, by the way, what I'm about to say is no shade at Snyder or frankly Bendis or King or any of the other writers there. But in terms of pulling sales, in terms of what gets people kind of jacked and excited to buy the issue in the store, it's Greg Capullo's artwork that is carrying a lot more of the load. And I hate to make the comparison because you need a story, you need a writer. You can't, as I think was perfectly illustrated in the 90s, you can't just dump one of them and everything works out okay. It doesn't. You may get a short-term pop, but it doesn't work okay. You need the two together. But if you're thinking about a big name acquisition, I'll put it this way. If Marvel suddenly said, all right, we're going to, we get one person from DC, just one. Actually, there's two ways I'm going to do this argument. So I'll do it this way first. I could get one. Which would create more value for Marvel? And when I say value, I mean people buying comics and other things. Which would create more attention for them? Would it be Greg Capullo or would it be Scott Snyder? Now, if they're smart, they get both. Don't get me wrong. But in terms of what would have probably a more immediate financial comic effect, it would be probably Greg Capullo. I think you could make a huge argument there. Now, where the story changes a little bit, and this is why I led off by saying the results on Bendis have yet to be seen, is if Marvel said, no, we want to go Scott Snyder, and then they set up a 10-year plan for Snyder to architect several books, that's going to be more valuable. That is going to be more valuable because you got multiple books, multiple lines, and other things. But in terms of kind of the marketing big impact to end customers and consumers, I think it tilts to the artist. And I'll put it another way. Jim Lee has been a writer and an artist. If you said, all right, Jim Lee is going to come over to my company for 2 years, I can get one or the other. I can get Jim Lee the writer. I can get Jim Lee the artist. Which are you going to get? Which would you pick? There's some subtlety to this point that makes it a little bit more difficult because I do want to stress that over the course of many years, a writer's impact is probably going to be more profound. They're going to launch books, they're going to create characters, they're going to create spin-offs, and if you have a very talented writer who's doing this stuff, they're creating a lot of long-term value for the company. But this is hard for a company to market. This isn't something that if you're Marvel, it's hard to go out with a message to say, hey, we've got this superstar writer coming in, and they're over the next 10 years, they're going to create a lot of really cool stuff. You want to stick with it and find out. It's a difficult message as opposed to saying, hey, here's something you can see. It's Greg Capullo, and it's a kick-ass page. He's now the new artist for the Avengers for the next year. That's kind of the difference. So some of this is value creation, some of this is marketing. That's kind of what I started this off with. What is the difference between the two, and where do you get that big bang for your buck? The comics are in a very strange place right now where marketing in general is pretty poor. And so you have to kind of really assess, with the very limited amount of resources we have, what's going to make the most sense and what's going to add the most value to the company and put things on the best footing. I think the world, and one other reason why I'm pushing down this path is that we have seen celebrity writers come in, and it's very different from the Scott Snyder analogy I was using earlier. If you said, all right, we've got J.K. Rowling is going to come in. Now, she's a massive, is there a bigger name in kind of fantasy and that stuff that you can imagine? J.K. Rowling is going to come in, and she's going to do a book at Marvel. Of course, you would promote the hell out of that. But Rowling, at the same time, is not going to be with the company for 10 years. She's going to do whatever, whatever the series is that she's writing, and go. And so, if you're promoting that, you have to be thinking with that in mind. You have to be thinking about somebody's going to come in, they're going to do this work, and they're going to leave. The J.J. Abrams and Son experiment is an interesting one because there was a lot of promotion, a lot of hype, a lot of articles, everything else done around that. But in all reality, we're not getting more than, I think it's a 5-issue series, 4 or 5, that we're getting out of that. That's it. And so, you have to be thoughtful about what you're doing with your marketing, because it will end, and then what? And then you got to have another plan, because you got to keep selling books. And so that's why all this, that's why it's an interesting. Generally, you want to market what you can see, or you want to market off of a mega name, certainly. But I don't think that the days of kind of the huge talent acquisition, if put it this way, if DC suddenly figured out that they could steal Donny Cates, would they do a similar Donny Cates is coming to DC, and put a bunch of fanfare around that? I don't think they would, or if they would, I think it would be a waste. I don't know. Ryan Stegman, on the other hand, you probably want to promote that art. It's an interesting topic. So I'd love to know what you think, because I think I could argue this both ways, and I'm sure you can too. So I'm interested to hear your opinion on all this. Hopefully this is food for thought. That was the point I was trying to do here. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter or Facebook at Comic Perch. But most importantly, thanks for listening.